Europe's unspoken backstop. It was never written into law, never voted on, and never clearly defined. Yet when stress appeared, markets behaved as if it existed. In Europe, stability often rests on guarantees no one openly acknowledges. To understand why this backstop mattered, we need to look at how modern systems survive without full political union. Europe shared a market and a currency, but not a single treasury. That gap created vulnerability, and within that vulnerability, an informal safety net emerged. The story begins after repeated near failures. Each time pressure built, fragmentation was feared but avoided. No country was allowed to fall in a way that threatened the whole. Over time, a belief formed. Europe would not permit systemic collapse, even if it never said so explicitly. Banks, investors, and governments absorbed that belief. Risk was still priced, but tail outcomes softened. Certain institutions enjoyed confidence, not because they were immune to failure, but because their failure was assumed to be unacceptable. The backstop lived in expectation rather than statute. Policymakers understood the danger of naming it. Formalizing the guarantee would invite moral hazard. Denying it would invite panic. Silence became policy. And silence, when reinforced by action in past crises, became credible. Markets tested the assumption repeatedly. Small shocks, local stress. Each time, support appeared indirectly. Liquidity expanded. Rules flexed. Coordination emerged. The backstop was never triggered, but it was always felt. What made this powerful was ambiguity. No one knew how far support would go, only that it existed somewhere. That uncertainty discouraged extreme bets. Standing against the system felt riskier than trusting it. But unspoken guarantees carry a cost. They stabilize behavior in crisis, but they distort incentives in calm. When protection is assumed, discipline fades quietly. Europe's unspoken backstop was not a mistake. It was a response to incomplete integration. It filled a gap that politics had not closed. But like all informal structures, it depended entirely on belief. And belief, once stretched too far, demands either clarification or confrontation. The backstop grew stronger precisely because it was never tested openly. Each episode of stress ended without rupture. Liquidity arrived. Coordination appeared. Fragmentation was avoided. And each success reinforced the assumption that Europe would always step in before collapse. Inside markets, this belief reshaped behavior. Risk was still evaluated, but the worst outcomes were discounted. Certain exposures were treated as safer than their fundamentals suggested, not because numbers justified it, but because history had conditioned expectations. Banks adjusted strategies accordingly. Capital was held, but confidence in systemic protection softened urgency. Cross-border exposures felt manageable because failure was assumed to be containable. The backstop reduced fear, but it also reduced vigilance. Policymakers watched the pattern with unease. The unspoken guarantee was stabilizing in crisis, but distorting in calm, yet confronting it directly risked unraveling confidence. Naming the backstop could force its use. Denying it could provoke the very crisis it had prevented, so silence persisted. The system relied on precedent rather than promise. Each intervention remained framed as exceptional. Even as exceptions accumulated, what was meant to be temporary began to feel structural. Markets adapted quickly. Pricing converged. Differentiation thinned. When protection is assumed, variation becomes unnecessary. That uniformity made the system efficient, but brittle. Alignment increased. Flexibility decreased. The danger was not immediate collapse. It was dependency. If belief in the backstop ever wavered, adjustment would be sudden. What had been smooth over time would reprice all at once. Europe's unspoken backstop had succeeded too well. It had removed panic without resolving uncertainty. And uncertainty, when suppressed rather than addressed, does not disappear. It waits. The question was no longer whether the backstop existed. It was whether Europe could continue relying on something that could not be named, measured, or limited, without eventually being forced to prove it. The moment of strain arrived when belief began to diverge from structure, not because a crisis erupted, but because conditions changed just enough to expose how much confidence depended on assumption. Funding costs started to separate unevenly. Some institutions retained trust effortlessly. Others faced questions that fundamentals alone could not answer. Markets were no longer asking whether Europe would intervene. They were asking how, when, and for whom. Inside financial institutions, unease spread quietly. Risk managers revisited scenarios they had long treated as theoretical. What if support arrived late? What if it arrived selectively? What if political alignment fractured just enough to slow coordination? The backstop, once comforting, now felt undefined. Policymakers felt the shift immediately. The unspoken guarantee had reached its most dangerous phase, not collapse, but expectation mismatch. Markets wanted clarity. Politics resisted it. The gap between belief and mandate widened. Signals were adjusted carefully. Language emphasized responsibility over rescue. Resolution frameworks were highlighted. Flexibility was framed as conditional rather than automatic. These were not dramatic changes, but they mattered. They reminded markets that protection was not a right. The response was uncomfortable. Pricing adjusted. Risk premiums returned where they had been absent. Volatility picked up briefly, not as panic, but as recalibration. The system was relearning differentiation it had smoothed away. What became clear was how fragile belief can be once it hardens. The backstop had worked best when it was uncertain. When markets began treating it as permanent, it lost stabilizing power. Europe faced a choice. Either formalize protection and accept distortion, or allow belief to thin and restore discipline. The path chosen was subtle, uneven, and deliberate. Let markets adjust without forcing a test of the guarantee itself. The unspoken backstop did not disappear. It receded into ambiguity again, where it functioned best. Because in systems built on belief, certainty is not always strength. Sometimes, uncertainty is the only thing that keeps discipline alive. The recalibration achieved what formal reform could not. Markets learned to live with uncertainty again. Pricing regained depth. Risk was differentiated rather than assumed away. The backstop remained in the background, present, but no longer central to every decision. Institutions adjusted behavior with maturity. Liquidity planning became more conservative. Exposure was managed with less reliance on collective rescue. The system did not lose confidence. It redistributed it. Policymakers absorbed the lesson quietly. Unspoken guarantees can stabilize fragile moments, but they must never become comfortable. Once protection is assumed, it stops deterring risk and starts enabling it. Europe's unspoken backstop survived because it was never confirmed. It functioned as a deterrent precisely because no one knew its limits. When belief began to harden, it was allowed to thin before being forced into the open. The episode reshaped how stability was understood, not as absence of risk, not as promise of rescue, but as balance between credibility and restraint. The backstop did its job without being used. And then, just as importantly, it stepped back. That restraint preserved its power for the moment it might be needed again, because guarantees that remain unseen are often the ones that work best. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Europe's